Hello everyone, we're going to do a valve adjustment, check-in adjustment on, this is a 96 Yamaha YZF 600R RHC California, but it will be the same for 95 to 07 USA YZF 600 and 600Rs regardless of California or not. To begin with here, we've removed fairings, gas tanks. I have my carburetors off for another reason, so I left them off. Technically I do believe you could leave them on, but it should be a lot easier with them off. I'm also going to attempt to leave the radiator attached and just drop it low and see if that'll give us enough clearance versus draining it, as I recently just put fresh in there. If I have to drain it, I will. Step one I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the radiator, which is attached with a bolt like this on each side, and then there's also one down here. Once you have those removed, the radiator will slag down. And now it is drooping. Notice I put a towel here just to protect my fender from me pulling down on this, so we can wiggle this however we need it to be to get access. I think we'll be able to do it with the radiator down there. I'm going to also unplug the electrics for the fan, just to give us as much slack as possible in this radiator system here. And I think that'll work. You should have pretty good access from the opposite side as well. Next I'm going to pull my spark plug boots. They are numbered from factory, if you notice. We've got 4, 3, 2, and 1, and they should go back in that order. To remove them, just pull and pull. Up top you have the coil tray. We're going to need to remove the coils and free up the electrics. I notice I might have some extra wires in here because I did a relay mod. Remove the coil, pull off on your rubber strap, release, and give them a wiggle and they'll pop out, and then disconnect your electrics. Label your electrics if you're not sure where to put them back, and then we'll be able to pass through this tray. Next, remove the Phillips head screw on each side that secures the tray to the side. Notice my coils are out, and for me I have to pull them through because they're attached on the older bikes, the leads of the spark plug wires to the coil, and I flip them out of the way. Again, I have extra wires that you might not have for my relay, and there's a bit of a mess. And then work the part down and towards the front of the bike. Be mindful of wires that you might catch, and eventually you'll be able to wiggle it out. Remove it completely. And then do whatever you need to get your wires as best out of the way as you can. I also recommend you cover your carburetor holes. I use caps from spray paint cans. Tape would be good, and stuff rag down there, whatever floats your boat. Now we're going to loosen the spark plugs, because then it'll make turning the motor over easier. There's 4 plugs. Blow out down inside there, because there's always debris, and it's always just a good rule of thumb to blow that out with a can of air or air compressor. Or if you were ambitious, you could have washed it ahead of time and blasted that area out with a garden hose and then let it dry all the way so you don't get water down in your cylinders. They don't have to come out all the way, just cracked. I am removing the coil holders. It'll just give us a little more access, and they're only 2 10mm bolts, so I'm going to take both of those out. Now I'm going to remove the stator cover. This will allow us to turn the motor over with a wrench and give us access to our timing marks. So there's a couple Allen cap head screws. I think they're 5mm. Looks like there's 2, 4, 5 of those, and then this will just pull off that way, and you can put it off to the side. Now you have access to this main crank. This is the end of your crankshaft. This is the stator rotor, the magnet here, and that is your rotor or coil assembly. Generates electricity and picks up timing marks. I'm going to leave this attached just because I don't want to fish through the cable, but I'm tying it up here to the shifter to take the weight off of it, so I'm not putting excess load on those wires. Now we're going to remove the valve cover. Like all things small, fragile, and aluminum, we're going to crack these loose maybe a quarter turn at a time, and we're going to go crisscross from the center out, just try and keep the pressure even as we undo it. There's a rubber grommet that comes with them. These are very fine thread, small bolts, so be careful. And then once we get these all out, we'll check back and look at separating the valve cover. Here are what the bolts look like once you get them loose. Again, you can always reference my other videos as best you can. My valve cover was off recently from my motor rebuilds. You notice it's kind of separated on its own without issue. But what you want to look for when you separate yours, especially if it's been a long time, these end caps here, these are the cam end seals here. Excuse me. I'm getting my terminology backwards. Anyway, you want to make sure these stay with the gasket. So when you first get it and it's stuck, you could tap it with a plastic hammer or a mallet on each side, a little bit here, and a little very gently. Just work it around, kind of break the seal. And if you get desperate, you could try a small, hopefully plastic, little tipped tool to try and pry that out. The main thing is you don't want to rip this. If you don't rip these, and there's 4 of them on each end of the cam, 2 cams, 4 of those, you can reuse this because it's a pretty thick, healthy rubber gasket. Otherwise, I think a new one's like 40 or 50. Baggies, very useful, and label. Write Sharpie on there, put some tape on there, label them so you know what they are. You put everything back. Also take lots of photos as you go along if need be. 1 remove valve cover. There is a front and there is a back. And I just got it screwed up. Here's your back. I will confirm that for you. It only fits one way is the main point to take from this. Notice my gasket is still in one piece. Sorry, I'm having brain farts this time around. Always reference my other videos as well. And notice the little crosses on here, molded in. Inside the motor here, this is your valve train. Here's your intake cam, because it's close to your carburetors, and that's the intake. Here's your exhaust cam, because your exhaust is out on the front. But these little rubber dimples here, these are isolators for the valve cover. Sometimes they pop out. If they pop out, push them back in. But you'll also notice that a lot of these will have little cross indentations on there for where it's been riding on them for so long. This right here is your case half. This is your timing reference for your stator rotor assembly here. And up here in your cams you have a little dimple, a little raised nub on the end of each cam here, and then there's going to be a hole on the end of this cam. And we're going to do these until these dots line up with these holes, and then this line will line up with the T mark on here. And let me show you. We will be turning the motor over counterclockwise, and we will be looking for timing marks. And because we undid those spark plugs, it's very easy to turn. We have indexed this and lined up our timing marks, and we've noticed we have a dot here and here, and a dot on the same cam as well. Up on this side, you can see a nub and a dot. Now, our cam lobes are opposite of each other, proving that number 1 cylinder is at TDC. Next, you will need a feeler gauge. Many types of feeler gauges. This is a standard flat, cheap style feeler gauge. There are also wires and individual feelers as well. This will work fine for our purposes. Something to note on feeler gauges is that they give measurements in thousandths, 0.002, or millimeters, thousandths of an inch, or millimeters, 0.05 millimeters. The manual gives the valve specifications in both thousandths of an inch and hundredths of a millimeter. You can use either when you spec your valves, when you write down your information. However, if you need to get shims, the chart only allows for millimeter references, so you'll need to convert them from thousandths of an inch to hundredths of a millimeter using an online calculator, or just read them in millimeters to begin with, and then you won't have to do a conversion. I have always read mine in thousandths because that is what I'm used to. You can certainly do it either way. Also, you should make a chart noting your valve orientation. Note, you have an intake cam and an exhaust cam. You have 2 valves per cylinder per cam. So you should label your chart on paper or as an Excel sheet like I have done. This is your stator side. That is your clutch side. We're talking about not the levers, we're talking about the actual clutch basket is on this side or that side. Or you could do right hand, left hand, you could do whatever you want, or you could even know that this is cylinder number 1, that's 2, that's 3, and that's 4, and you would know that from your plug wires as well. But you need to know that and have reference. And you also need to know that this intake is different than this intake, so you want to maintain your orientation however way you do it. So you know that your intakes are labeled as intakes 1 and 2 for cylinder 1, and exhausts for 1 and 2 for cylinder 1 and cylinder 2, and so on and so on. It's up to you to keep this straight and remember. Let's show you how to measure one. I have measured mine previously and I know what I'm to be expecting. But you would start with, say, something reasonable, like say a 5 thousandths. Another thing to note is usually these feeler gauges come packed in oil, so they can be slippery and hard to manage, and that's to prevent rust and keep them clean when you're doing this as well. So for example, I have a 5 thousandths feeler gauge right here. I will take that and I will put it underneath this valve. It slides in freely, so I know that that gap is bigger than 5 thousandths. Now I can move to 6 thousandths. It's a little bit more snug, but I can still get it in there. Now we will do a 7 thousandths, and that is pretty tight. It has a little bit of grab as you're sliding through, but you can still do it easier, in and out easily. Going to an 8 thousandths now. 8 thousandths simply won't fit. You just can't do it. Therefore, this is a 7 thousandths of an inch, 0.18 hundredths of a millimeter gap for the exhaust valve 1 in my naming scheme for cylinder 1. Then you would do the same procedure. You can start with whatever. Once you get a feel for it, you kind of know. I'm starting with my 5 again. 5 goes in there real easy, and we'll go up to our 6 and our 7. And I know this one is about an 8. It's a little tricky to do while holding a camera. And that is a 7, and it fits. And this one is an 8, and I know the 8 will fit. Notice these are still opposite of each other. We can only do cylinder 1 right now. And then to do the back ones, you do the same thing. You can either come from back here, which is how I choose to do it, and slide in and out in each of those. Or you can go up from the top and try and sneak around this direction too, which is fine. Either way it is fine. And you feel for the one that'll fit last, and then that's the number that you would write down. Now that we have done all the measurements for cylinder number 1, we would rotate through until we get cylinder number 2. However, the firing order on these bikes are 1, 2, 4, all the way at the end, 3. So if we want to do this as minimal turns as possible, however, you could screw up and go around the horn and come around again. Don't worry about it, but the manual tells you to do it in the firing order, because then you have to turn the crank by hand the least amount of times. We would turn this a quarter turn, and then as we do that, cylinder number 2 valves are going to go opposite of each other, just like cylinder 1 is, and that's how we'll know that cylinder number 2 is at top dead center on the compression stroke. You notice that these number 2 valves are pointing towards the front on the exhaust cam, and the number 2 valves are pointing towards the back on the intake cam. So now these are ready to be measured in the same procedure that we did for number 1, making good notes of where they are and their sizes. After we've measured our number 2, and this time we're going to number 4 in the firing order, so these lobes will be opposite of each other, pointing outwards. And now we will rotate a final time until cylinder number 3's lobes are opposite of each other, so we can check spec for them. Now that we have measured all of our valve clearances, and let's assume you found some out of spec, as I did with mine, the next thing to do would be to remove your tensioner, which is down in here, and then we're going to remove the main center chain guide. Chain guide is held on with 8mm bolts. Go crisscross, loosen them slightly, and then go crisscross, slightly loosen, and go even as much as you can to lift that piece off. They are shared bolts with part of the cam caps, which are a bearing surface underneath these, and these are very fragile, so we have to be extra careful when we loosen these and install them. So first I'm going to remove this part. We're removing the cam center guide as a unit and baggie and label. Orientation matters. Put everything back the way you found it. Next I'm going to be removing the tensioner assembly here. First we are going to loosen the tensioner spring bolt. There's a spring under here, so when you release it, it will pop back a bit. And then we'll undo the mounting bolts left and right, and then this whole assembly will pull off. Okay, cracked it loose, and I'm removing it by hand. Gotta be aware that there is that spring under there and this copper crush washer. And there it came. There's actually 2 springs in here, an inner and an outer spring. Keep them together so you know that there are those 2 springs in there. Next I'll be removing this side. And the whole assembly comes out. And if you didn't take the spring out, once you lose the tension on this side, this would shoot all the way out. And it's not the end of the world, but it's just annoying. You should do it with the cap bolt first and then these bolts. There's a gasket under here. I recently replaced mine, so I was able to take mine out clean, so I'm going to reuse this. Otherwise, you technically could do some kind of RTV down there, or get a new gasket. They're pretty cheap. If you look down the hole, the black part you're seeing there is the cam chain guide on the back side that puts the tension on the chain. See my other videos for more detailed information on that. Now that our cam tensioner is out and our cap is loose, you'll notice we have slack in our chain. Also, your cams might shift and come to a natural resting point. That's okay. Just don't hit the starter or crank it over by hand. Your valves may hit because your things are not in time anymore. It sounds scarier than it is. For a lot more detailed information, see my other videos. What we're going to do now is wrap a wire around this, so if it drops down in there, we can get it. A magnet will work too, but you might as well be prepared and wire this up so it can stay. I'd like to show you some moment now for the cam caps. It's going to be tricky to see as I have poor lighting right now, but your cam caps are labeled. Other videos show more detail. You have arrows and you also have letters. We got R1, R intake, R intake. They're stamped in there. I apologize, they're hard to see. My other videos picked them up better. So you know your intake is stamped I, then you know the orientation of your arrows. Arrows point towards each other, and you want the writing to be normal. So, to do this, you can go by these markings. You can't mix it up. The manual even says exactly where they're supposed to go, but it can be pretty scary when you're hunting for these marks and not sure is it an I, is it an E for exhaust or an I for intake, and the numbering. But it is definitive, so don't panic if something goes awry. But I would highly recommend you label it yourself with some methodology so that you know where they came from and you can put them back in a way that you're comfortable with, and you can rely on the manual and factory marks as a backup. Now comes the scariest part. We're going to break loose our cam caps. They're labeled, I've taken a picture, and I wrote it down. So I know I can put them back where I found them. They're going to loosen these bolts in a crisscross fashion, just a quarter or an eighth of a turn at a time until it all comes out evenly. The spring tension on the valve is going to want to push these cams up, and we don't want to warp or crack anything. So by turning each bolt an even amount, it'll rise in an even fashion and won't put too much load on any one area, causing a warp or a crack. And once they are all free, then we can just lift off the cam covers, and then it'll be time to remove the cams so we can get access to the buckets and change out our shims. You might want to maintain orientation of your bolts. A lot of people prefer to put everything back where they found them, but honestly they're all the same bolts. They can go back in different holes if you would like. These are very fine torque. Be careful, go slow. Here, I have one cap off. Nope, they are dowels. There are dowels in 3 locations. Sometimes they stick with the cap, sometimes they stay behind. They are in opposite locations here, and that one stayed with the cam cap. I recommend taking the dowels out because they can get in the way of removing and installing the cams, so just take them out, make note of them. They only fit in one location on the cam cap because there's only the holes big enough for them. You can see this one stayed behind, and you can see this one is a bigger hole. And then they will stay in there in the dowels. You can see there's a big hole up in that top one where a dowel would go. It's like there's a bigger hole in this lower one where a dowel would go. Maintain orientation. 3 dowels per cap. Don't lose them. Don't drop them in anywhere. And a magnet is very handy in removing dowels. Sometimes they're in there pretty tight, and you need perhaps a electrical tape tipped needle nose plier, a small one, but a magnet and some wiggling seems to work pretty good. We now have the cam caps off, and this is a good time to inspect your camshaft for abnormal wear. You'll see some shiny spots. You're looking for any deep grooving, gouging, run your fingernail across it. Same thing with the underside of the caps, and once we get the cams out, the top of the cylinder head where they ride. Truthfully, there isn't a whole lot you can do about it, as these are not replaceable bearings, these are machined surfaces. There are steps that could be taken, but they're highly expensive, and truthfully you'd be better off most likely buying a used motor in good condition if you had some serious issues. Otherwise, I would just say let it rock and roll unless you see something really terrible. So I've only been in a few of these. They all seem to wear pretty nicely. This bike has just shy of 42,000 miles on it. And so the caps are off, and now the cams are loose in here. So you would roll this forward and then lift up on your chain at the same time, and then you would slide it out the side of the bike to get this out of the way. Your cams are also marked intake and exhaust, but again, it's a good idea for you to keep orientation of them, remember where they go. The sides with the discs that had the holes in it for alignment go on the stator side, cylinder number 1, and they can only go there. Well, I guess that's not, there is grooves on both sides, but they need to go on that side and that side only, I should say, and I do believe they only fit really one way, ideally. And then we can access the buckets and shims and start swapping out shim sizes. Wire on the chain so we don't lose it. Tensioner is off. We have the tensioner hole stuck with our rags so we don't lose anything in there. We can roll this forward, and then we might need to pull out. There's a rubber guide in here. That can get pushed out of the way. This front one can be pulled out completely, and I'll show you that when we get there if we need the space. So right now I've moved this forward, and I'll have the slack in the chain to lift this one out. Cams are removed. These are the buckets. Underneath them are the shims. So this was your first time in there and you didn't know what shims you had. You remove these buckets. A magnet works fantastic. You give it a wiggle, and then you slide that up and out. I'll have to see there's a little recess at the top there. That's where the shim goes. The shim will stick to the bucket most of the time. And it's this tiny little piece of metal in there. And I'll show you on the bench better. But that has a number on it, and you would want to make, it's a good idea when you're in here to write down all your shim numbers in the same mapping scheme as you did when you were measuring clearances. That way you'll always know what shims you have in there, and you can save yourself a step in the future when you need to adjust. So you don't need to write down all your shims again. You know what you have, so you know what you need to swap to based on your gap in the chart, which I will explain. My exhaust, cylinder number 1 exhaust valve is too tight, so I'm going to be pulling that out and swapping the shim over for a different one. This is an actual shim. You can try and see it. See, it says it's a 172. That's 1.72 millimeters thick. Going by the chart, which I will explain, but I cannot show you, I don't think, for legal reasons, copyright issues. But this is too tight, so I need one that is smaller to increase the gap. So I'm going to a 165. They only come in sizes of 5, so 160, 165, 170, which is 1.7, 1.65, so on and so on. These are the hot cam replacements I bought. This is a 165 and it does measure out. The calipers, I guess, are pretty close. And that one was a 1.72 mil. These can be had on eBay for around like $3 or $4 a piece, so they are expensive. So it's kind of good to know what you need ahead of time. You can buy a whole kit for like 70 or 80, which should have most everything you need. Dealers will have them, and often they will swap you shims. Maybe swap out your 190 for a 185, perhaps. Some of them do it, some of them don't. These are 7.48 millimeters in diameter, which is the size we use. And then I'm going to put this 165 in place of the 172 on the number 1 exhaust valve in my number 1 cylinder, which will increase the gap and loosen it up because it was on the very tight side of spec. Ideally, I'm shooting for the middle as much as I can. My new shim is right on top of the valve. It sat down in the little hole there and it just sits there. It has a recess, don't drop it. Use a magnet to keep everything handy, and then you just simply place the bucket on top. It's a good idea to take out the front chain guide to give you more slack when reinstalling your cams. Simply grab a plier and pull up and out, and it removes. If you were smart, you would have kept your timing marks aligned. You would have went back to the number 1 TDC before you took your cams off. I did not. But if you hold your chain up while you're rotating it, you can put this back. As long as this lines up, it's lined up, and then you'll index your cams accordingly up there. Everything will work out. So never panic if your timing is out of whack. See my other videos for more information. With the number 1 cylinder at TDC lined up with our crank timing marks and confirmed by pulling the spark plug out and seeing that it was all the way at the top, what we will do is we will hold our chain up, and it's difficult to see, but you want to make sure that you're around the cam gear completely. You can feel it with the chain to make sure you have the right slack and you're not slipping any teeth or it'll bind. But you'll hold this up and you'll put the exhaust cam in first and try and align it as best you can to close with the dots on the top of the cam. It's a guessing game at first to get that on there, and you just set the cam caps on to begin with. And then when you have that one pretty close, you will install the intake cam while stretching this over and trying to get them both together with as much tension as possible. Again, we remove this front guide so we have a little more play with our chain. But when you put in the back cam, the intake cam, it'll likely move the exhaust cam. So you kind of have to see how much it moves and then accommodate for it by putting the exhaust one in slightly off time, and then when you put in the intake one, it'll pull it back to time. It's a game of trial and error. As long as you don't crank the motor over while you're trying to install the cams, you can't hurt anything. And when you tighten your cam caps, make sure you follow specifications. Go in a crisscross pattern from center to out, going minor turns at a time to even up the pressure so we don't crack or bind anything. Pre-coat everything with oil. It'll probably be oily because this was a running motor. And the motor, in the engine manual, it'll say to pre-assemble with molybdenum. You could technically do that, moly lube, but it's going to be engine oil, so I just use my little oil can here and I oil up everything a second time when I'm putting it in. Same oil you'd use for the bike. As stated previously, the cams are marked. This has an E on it. I don't know how well we can see it, but there is an E there. And the other one is stamped with an I, but I would prefer to maintain my own orientation when I'm taking things apart and going back the way I took it apart. Now I have both cams loosely installed. I will set on the caps and see how close we are in alignments. If you remember, we wanted our lobes opposite of each other when we were at TDC, so if we get them roughly opposite, we should be close. You want to keep as much tension on them as possible as you go down, and then the tensioner will take up the slack on the inboard side, carburetor side, once you put the tensioner back in. So you want to keep the exhaust side as tight as you can, because that won't be taken up by the tensioner. Alright, I have my initial setup done. Really close. If you look at these dots, don't expect them to be 100%. It's really close. They don't line up perfectly, as you noticed when you took them out. So don't freak out. And if you know, you can fiddle with it plus or minus a tooth, and you can fiddle with your orientation there. But the odds of it being 100% dead on, we just have not seen on the forums from everything we've ever posted. But we'll get really, really close. We don't have any real fine adjustment with these, but if you see, I mean, we're really, really close, and they're going to move some once we go. So I kept tension on this side as much as I could, and I got this lined up, and then I just set this one on, this exhaust one on, and did my best to kind of line up where this is going to end up. And then you have to cheat this back cam at the same time to pull it forward to give you the slack to adjust this one, and then you kind of set the rear one on, and then fiddle with the back one and try and get that as best you can and keep tension tight. I push through the tensioner hole, which I have a rag stuffed in now so stuff doesn't fall out. I push in there to take the slack up out of the chain as best I could, and then I set the other ones on, and then I finger them in real finger tight, a couple turns just so they don't fall off. Make sure you have all of your dowel pins in there. There's 3 per each thing. I kept my orientation. I have the I's that I wrote on here. This is I1, that's I2 for intake, my E1 and my E2 for exhaust, even though they are stamped from factory. I went with my numbers. And you might notice, I mentioned earlier, these rubber caps can fall off, and I am missing one. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Missing one right here. Make sure these are clean. And these just plug right in, and that's what the valve cover rested against, if you recall. And they just set on there, and there's 3 of those per cam cap. Now it's a matter of doing the crisscross. Highly recommend you look at your service manual. I'm not going to tell you specifically. I want you to look it up so you can see it, the pattern in which you tighten these, and then go real gentle. And you do very light torque. I don't want to say a number either. I want you to look it up. I don't recall. It's less than 10. Buy a 1/4 inch torque wrench. I don't care if you have a $15 Harbor Freight 1/4 inch when they're on sale. I honestly have that one. It's better than guessing. Don't use a 3/8. You don't want to break anything in here. And then when you have a torque wrench, especially any clicker torque wrench, find a big bolt first. Set it to the setting you want, and then get a feel for where the breakaway point is going to be. That way you won't have any surprises when you're tightening, like, man, I really thought this would have clicked by now. What's going on? Always test first, because you never know if calibration got way off. All of a sudden you're trying to torque a 5-pound, foot-pound bolt, and you're actually set at like 20, and then you break it off before you realize that you shouldn't have gone so far. Again, cheap 1/4 inch is better than no 1/4 inch, and you definitely want a 1/4 inch drive torque wrench when you're doing these cam caps. When you've got that on and your chain is tight, put your front tensioner back in. It can be tricky, but it can be done with everything in the bike. It can be done. Just find your method to get in here, angle and slide down. Keep tension on the tensioner side by putting your finger in the hole and just holding in. And then you should turn it over a couple of times and make sure it goes through the cycle. Real easy. If you meet any resistance, stop. Check everything. I just turned mine over twice, and it was so far so good. Now I'm going to recheck my valve clearances the same way I did before to see what changes have been made. And then from there we'll see if I need to undo it and make any more changes. I've gone through and turned my motor over several times now, and I went through and redid all my valve checks, and the changes that I needed to be made changed have been changed. I think we're pretty good. I am on slight tight side of middle. I was shooting for middle. A couple of them are 1/1000th under middle. We're pretty okay with that. There wasn't too much major drastic things. Realistically, I probably didn't need to do too much adjusting, if any. I probably could have let it go for a while and just maybe go down a little bit more noisy. Valve adjustment, I think, is supposed to happen at 26,000 or so. You have to look in your manual, and again, the bike has 42,000. This is the first time it's ever been done because I've had the bike since almost new. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the center chain guard back on, and we will torque those in a crisscross. Remember reorientation when you took it off that you indexed. Confirm you got all of your rubber caps on. You got 3 on each thing. And I torqued these, and I'm going to check them again when I'm torquing this cap on in crisscross pattern as specified in the manual to this torque specified with my 1/4 inch torque wrench. Next we will reset the tensioner. Notice it's out. We need it to be back to a neutral position so it'll find itself again. There's a little tab here. You can flex that down and push the plunger in. The spring is not in it right now, nor is the cap bolt. First we will put this back to the motor, torque it to spec, check your gasket. There is an up marked on here. And make sure your up is up. My tensioner is installed again and torqued to spec. Make sure you have your copper crush washer. Make sure you use both springs when you put them back in there. Now that I got my top end pretty much all buttoned up, before I put the valve cover on again, I'm going to turn the motor through its cycles again, just to make sure everything is free, moving, not binding, and then take a look at my chain tension as it goes around. Reinstall your valve cover. Dent goes at the front. Again, it only fit one way. Got it backwards, flip it around. Be mindful of your 3 per cap rubber deals. So there will be 6, there'll be 12 of those total. When you put this on, you don't want to knock one off and have it just flopping around in there. That could be bad. I had one knock off and fall on the floor, and then I found it later, only to realize I got to take the valve cover off again. It's annoying. And then you will put back in your valve cover bolts, torque them to spec in crisscross sequence. And then your motor is reassembled, and then it's back to just remounting your coils, running your electricals neater. Put your radiator back, 3 bolts, carbs, tank, all that good stuff. I know there's still quite a few steps in process here, but just make sure before you button everything up that you're satisfied with your valves. Even if it means you're going to have to order a new shim or something, don't think you'll just get it another time. You're in there now, do it now. If it was time for spark plugs, you might want to change plugs. I recently just did mine when I rebuilt my motor and trans, as seen in the other videos. Take your time, turn that motor over several times, by hand, very gently and slow. Just look at everything as it goes around, make sure it goes in normal sequence when they go opposite of each other, which is 1, 2, 4, 3, just like when you were doing your timing thing. Make sure when it comes back all the way around, your timing marks line up at the stator assembly, down there with your T and your case halves, and then your dots on your cams. If everything lines up after you do that several times, button it up. Button it up and get back together, and then crank it. I would probably dry crank it first before I'd actually fire it, before I'd hook fuel up to it. See if it turns over without issues. And then rock and roll. Don't forget to retorque your spark plugs. Now is a very convenient time to get to them before you put everything else together. Almost forgot myself.